Why is it that everyone loves a good ghost story? Is it simply because people like to be scared? Or is there something more behind its allure? To many, stories tap into our fear of the unknown, which ignites a fascination with worlds beyond the edge of reason. People seem not to care as to whether these stories are truthful. Perhaps because truth is not always as fascinating as where our minds are capable of taking us. In 1858, a beautiful Italianate-style mansion was built on a 240 acres of land in the south side of Indianapolis by a middle-aged bachelor named Alexander Hanna. Born in Wayne County, Indiana, he trained as a harness maker, but soon left his business to seek his fortune in the California gold rush. Years later, he returned to Indiana with enough money to buy a large farm and build Hanna House. Many stories about Alexander Hanna's life have circulated throughout the years, but most remember him for his strong stance against slavery and as the son of the prominent political figure Samuel Hanna. Today, his house is most notably known for its haunted reputation.
There are many legends surrounding Hanna House, but the majority of people know the legend connected with the Underground Railroad. Presumably, during the time that the slaves were moving from the south toward Canada, this was one of the stop-offs for the Underground Railroad. And one cold, horrible night, a group of slaves seeking sanctuary entered the yard of the Hanna House. The Hannas took this group into their home, took them down to the cellar where they normally housed them until they could move them onward to Canada and freedom. When they took them then, they also gave them fresh water and some cold meat, and they gave them lanterns to dispel the darkness of this dungeon-like atmosphere. Something happened during the night. No one really knows what actually happened, but a lantern was evidently knocked over during the night. A fire erupted. They died in that cellar. Hanna's wanted to give them a Christian burial, but if they did, then the secret that this was an Underground Railroad stop would be known, and they wouldn't be able to help other slaves find peace and freedom. So they had to bury those poor souls in the cellar of Hanna House. And from that day, the story has grown that the house is haunted, and it's haunted by the souls of those poor slaves who died in that horrible fire that one cold winter night.
The story of haunted Hanna House has been told throughout generations for over 2 decades. Stories like these give shape to our basic wishes and fears of a culture. Stories open the doors to these wishes and fears that could not otherwise be understood outside the context of a narrative.
The reason that all cultures tell stories is that stories are the best mechanisms that human beings have devised for expressing our basic wishes and our basic fears. There's a general fear of the unknown that ghost stories tap into. It. We're drawn to things that we don't understand because it's a realm of adventure and uncertainty and risk, putting them in the context of a story with a beginning and a middle and an end. We give those stories a sense of meaning that they wouldn't have. We give the fears and wishes, I would say, a meaning that they wouldn't have in isolation.
The first account that I know of that happened in Hannah House, which was supposedly a haunting experience, was experienced by the owner, Mr. Elder.
I always felt that there was always somebody watching me, especially when you come out of the basement, you would have the cold chills.
He went in there one night and he was looking around and he heard, according to him, he heard a sound coming from the cellar of breaking glass.
And you can feel the sense that somebody is watching you, and you turn around, of course, in the basement there was nobody there, whether the ghosts had disappeared or whether they had vanished or whether it was just your imagination.
He rushed down to the cellar because he thought perhaps some children from the neighborhood had broken in.
We had a lot of fruit jars in the basement with different items canned for the wintertime. And one night when I was here in the house, the fruit jars to me had been tipped over, and the sound was so loud that I thought the kids or somebody had got into the basement and had tipped over a barrel of fruit jars.
This account is the one that started the main stories of the haunting of Hannah House.
Indeed, Mr. Elder's haunted experience stirred the public's interest with the house. However, this was surely not the only time that such unusual activity would be witnessed.
One individual told me that his mother used to drive to Indianapolis, where she worked, pass Hannah House every day. She would glance at the yard, and there would be a man standing in the yard in 1800 clothing, waving at her as she drove by. One time, Mr. Elder, the owner of Hannah House, used to have bands on the lawn and so forth, and there was a New Age band there. And one day, a lady told me that she had been a member of this band that had been playing at Hannah House. And she pulled their van up in front of the house so they could load their equipment on. And as she got out of the van, she looked up at the top of the house and she saw a woman in the window in 19th century clothing looking down at her.
In 1872, Hannah married Elizabeth Jackson, giving up 51 years of bachelorhood. As the story goes, the couple gave birth to a stillborn child in the upstairs room of the house, now known as the haunted room. Years later, one of the tenants living in this house began noticing a ghastly stench of rotting flesh.
There was one bedroom upstairs that she said smelled terrible, like something had died. Well, they got a fumigator in there. They thought perhaps it was a possum or something that had gotten between the floor joists. There wasn't anything they could find. They actually raised up some of the floorboards. There was nothing there. No dead mice, nothing. The smell persisted. It wasn't constant, but it was frequently there. She actually used carbolic acid to scrub the floor in that room to try to get rid of the odor, so she said. The odor still was there. They called in a psychic. The psychic claimed that Mrs. Hannah had given birth, a stillborn, in that room, and that the smell that they smelled was of the stillborn. As far as anybody knew until that day, the Hannahs never had any children.
The psychic and the tenant went out to the graveyard where the Hannahs are buried.
There between them was a gravesite with no name on it, a baby's gravesite.
Apparently, the infant had lived less than 1 day, for only a single date was chiseled on the tombstone.
The house is never haunted while the Hannah family itself is living there. It's later on, the memory of this somehow comes back to the house or inhabits the house.
In 1895, Alexander died inside his house, leaving no heirs. The house and 21 acres were sold in 1899 to Roman Ayler, owner of a prosperous jewelry store in Indianapolis, and later acquired by his daughter, Romana Ayler Elder. It was eventually rented out to the O'Brien family in 1972, and used as an antique shop. Little did they know that the house was haunted.
They rented the house from Mr. Elder when he first opened it up.
And Mr. and Miss O'Brien lived upstairs in one room, and then they had an antique store here for 10 years. And of course, when they moved in, the house was right after that was vacant, and that's when the spirits and things were here in the house.
Presumably, when they first started to come into the house, clean it up, they volunteered to do painting and so forth. There were some problems that arose. Mrs. O'Brien's son said that he would finish the painting. He and his wife were in this one room painting on the lower level. The little girl was sitting on the steps playing. Her father heard her talking to someone. He thought maybe somebody was in the house, and he rushed into the hallway and asked her who she was talking to. And she said, "The man up there," and she pointed up the steps. He ran up the stairs to see if somebody was upstairs. He searched through all the rooms. There was no one there.
This is not the only haunting that the O'Briens experienced in the year that they lived in the Hannah house.
The next gentleman that came to paint was painting upstairs in the hallway. And Mrs. O'Brien decided that she would serve him a cup of coffee. So she went downstairs and got him a cup of coffee, put it on a tray with sugar and cream and a spoon.
They were in the front of the house upstairs having coffee before they started their work of painting the rooms and cleaning things up.
She no sooner set the tray down when the teaspoon went flying across the floor and hit the wall. Well, the man left, needless to say.
It startled the man so that he didn't come back to do any more work.
Hannah House has several smaller stories that are known, but primarily the slave story is the one that everybody really knows.
In the years since the alleged tragic events that happened in the basement, peculiar activities have occurred, such as unexplainable sounds, moving chandeliers, and the occasional sightings of ghostly apparitions. Perhaps the spirits of the house had some unfinished business.
I think what the stories do is attempt to give specific but not necessarily totally certain meaning to the fears associated with that house. And I think that when there are essential wishes and fears that are culture-wide or very widespread, stories will spring up to give expression to those wishes and fears.
It's a very strong possibility that the story of the slaves dying in the house is based on our guilt. I think that this is one of the reasons why it is being maintained. We do have this guilt about the slavery.
Because slavery was a huge national issue and a source of great guilt, it's not surprising that stories spring up to sort of capture the way we feel about that.
And then there were people who were involved in the Underground Railroad. And this was an illegal activity. It was against the law to help a fugitive. The Underground Railroad was a movement in which people worked together to help enslaved Africans find freedom. Sometimes it was help in just a way of directions or food and clothing. Other times it was someplace to stay for the night, or maybe somebody moved someone to a new location.
Alexander Hannah was risking his reputation by harboring slaves in his basement. But interestingly enough, no one is even certain that the house was a station on the Underground Railroad. Evidence that this fire actually happened is also yet to be proven. Instead, people rely on the lore. Perhaps this is the reason why no one can pinpoint any conclusive evidence.
Some people were very secretive about what they did. Even after the war and after it was no longer illegal and they couldn't be arrested or be injured from a mob or something like that, they didn't want to talk about it. Everybody wants to be a part of the Underground Railroad. They want their house to be a part of it. They want their family to have been a part of it, because slavery is a sore subject with us, and it's a tough subject for us to deal with. And to say that you were a part of the Underground Railroad meant you helped. It meant you weren't one of them who owned slaves or turned their head or did nothing.
How do the facts line up with the lore? Is the haunting believable? Or do the missing pieces to the puzzle simply make the story that much more interesting?
The Underground Railroad did have homes around here that were a part where people could go for sanctuary.
There's always a possibility of any house being a part of the Underground Railroad, but what we need is evidence. The first thing we do is we ignore the house itself, because the house didn't do anything. It's the people who lived there that did things. So we're going to look at the Hannahs and what were they like, and whether they were likely to have participated. What was their religion? What were their organizations? Were they Republican or Democrats?
Alexander Hannah was a birthright Quaker, and the Quakers did allow their homes to be a part of the Underground Railroad. However, he did not belong to a Quaker church. He supported all churches. But being a birthright Quaker, Quakers themselves did not believe in slavery. They did not believe in war. So it stands to reason that if a birthright Quaker owned and lived in that house, the house probably was a part of the Underground Railroad.
Just because he's Republican and a Quaker does not mean he was necessarily involved in the Underground Railroad. There were Quakers who split over this issue. And we're going to look at all these pieces. We may never find that smoking gun, but we may find a lot of circumstantial evidence that pinpoints that somebody was participating.
The story itself is so embedded in the history of the city that it's a belief system that you cannot take away from people. People want to believe. They do know that there was an Underground Railroad. They do know that several Quaker homes were a part of the railroad. It's a possibility that somebody did, or more than somebody, did die in that house. You can't take the stories away from them, and as long as the stories are passed from generation to generation, the belief system is always going to be there, and it's just embedded in our social history now.
The Haunting of Hannah House tells about our social history as much as it tells an entertaining story. For over 2 decades, the story has been passed down from generation to generation, its popularity maintained because it follows the ingredients of a good ghost story.
The ingredients of a good ghost story. You have to have something horrible to get people to get that chilly feeling, or something like in Hannah House, it was horrible. The fire was horrible, that those poor people died in that dank dungeon in a fire. It has to be something that is frightening, something that touches your heart. That touches your heart to think these poor people, men, women, and some children, wanted freedom so much that they put themselves through this only to die a horrible death in a fire. Ghost stories are told to explain things that we do not understand, things that we want to explain.
I think people tell ghost stories because we are fascinated with the unknown and the dangerous. We are drawn to it because it is out of the ordinary, and we are afraid of it because it is a threat to us at the same time.
People are intrigued about the other worlds, worlds that we don't understand. When you tell a story, you get the feeling of, chills up and down your spine and so forth. That's sort of a primordial situation that we have built into us. Through the generations, the stories are told from one person to the next, and each person adds a little bit of something. It's not a lie, it's not a made-up thing. It's a color. They add color to a story to make it more interesting. And after a while, it gets a little bit out of proportion. But the kernel of truth of the story, or the kernel of the story itself, is always there. It's always going to be there. Portions of the stories, I believe, have been distorted in an effort to promote the house as a place to go to visit. For a long time, the house was used by the J.C.'s as a haunted house, and then that stopped. I believe people probably stopped going to the house, visiting the house. Perhaps the stories started dying out. So then new stories had to be generated, perhaps even generated by the owners of the home to say, oh, I've heard something in the house is haunted. And then that gets people interested again, and they start revisiting the house, and then the stories get regenerated and new life put into the ghost stories.
We had haunted house there in the house for 22 years, which we had one of the better houses. People come from all over.
During the time when the house was used as a commercial haunted house, the Southport J.C.'s claimed to have witnessed a variety of weird occurrences. The most famous of them all was the mysterious swaying of the chandelier. One member claimed that it was odd to see the chandelier moving for no reason. He thought he had bumped into it with his shoulder.
A couple of the men were in the kitchen waiting until time for people to come through. Presumably, according to them, their equipment turned on, haunting music turned on. Nobody was near the equipment. They had to turn the equipment off. They also said that they heard somebody enter the house, but it was not time for people to come into the house. They got up to go see who it was, but there was nobody there. People probably do exaggerate their experiences at any haunted location, but I don't think it is consciously. They just like to color them a little bit more to get people more interested in what they're saying. Did they truly have those experiences? J.C.'s are a very active organization, so of course everybody who is involved with the J.C.'s would have heard about these experiences. Did they actually happen? Or were they contrived to get more people there for the haunted house that year? Perhaps the haunted house was becoming passé and they needed to kick it up a notch, shall we say. So they came up with, we were sitting there having a conversation when all of a sudden the music came on. Or we were sitting there wondering, how did that happen, when all of a sudden we heard footsteps entering the building? Wouldn't that get a lot of people to come and visit the J.C.'s haunted house? I look for the truth in the story, the kernel of truth, the history. That's why I say folklore and history have got to go together. You cannot just take a story as the gospel truth, especially hauntings, but all folklore stories have that kernel of truth.
Storytelling is one of society's most powerful art forms. Although stories are entertaining, they also provide a means to journey into the past and create a shared experience among the characters and listeners.
If I tell a story and you listen to that story and I can hear you responding to it, then we are on the same page, and that's very satisfying.
People love to tell stories. We are naturally storytellers.
People tell stories so that people will respond to them and to find out, really, I think, what they have in common.
They don't want that truth. They want their story. They don't want a revisionist form of folklore. They don't care if there really was a fire in the cellar. As long as they want to believe it, they will believe it, no matter how much you prove that there are discrepancies in the story, that it's a lot of made-up stuff. Nobody's going to ever believe you. And even if they do, they're still going to tell the story the way they want to tell it, the way that it intrigues everybody and keeps it going.
And while the story of the haunted Hannah House continues to be passed down from generation to generation, no one really cares that the facts don't line up with history. Maybe the fire never actually happened in the basement. Maybe the Hannah House was never a station on the Underground Railroad. And maybe all the hauntings were made up. What makes this estate one of the 10 creepiest places in America? The mystery may never be solved. Perhaps this is why the story is so fascinating. This is the haunting of Hannah House.